The wind cut like a knife through the ribcage of the town, shrieking through the gaps in shuttered windows, rattling the bones of the abandoned railroad depot. The sky, thick with frozen breath, threatened snow that hadn't yet fallen, but already tasted of death. A town too new to be old and too tired to be young. Just a scar across the endless prairie. From the back of a moving wagon, a body flew through the air, landed with a sickening crack in the slush-packed mud. A woman. Her once elegant dress was torn, stained with weeks of filth, the hem crusted with dried blood. She hit the ground hard, curling over a small cloth purse held tight to her chest like it held her soul. Inside, 17 cents. The wagon driver spit in the dust without stopping. "Ain't no charity in Cheyenne," he barked over his shoulder. Then he and the creaking wheels vanished into the rising wind. Voiceover. "They said she'd never survive the night, but the West doesn't care what they say." Clara Merriweather blinked through a curtain of red as her vision swam. Her lip was split, her ribs ached, and a bruise flowered beneath her collarbone like a violet in rot. She had come west with lace gloves, satin shoes, and a name people whispered. With respect back in Boston, that name meant nothing now. Out here it might as well have been carved on a gravestone. Once she was a banker's wife, educated, proper, a lady with opinions too sharp for polite company and dresses tailored in Paris. But none of that stopped Franklin Merriweather from gambling away their fortune, nor from taking up with a saloon girl named Ruby, with too much rouge and not enough clothing. He left Clara behind, first in spirit, then in body. She followed him west not to reclaim him, but to understand what had shattered, to gather the pieces if any remained. But when she arrived, he was already gone again. Ruby said he'd headed toward Colorado chasing silver. The landlord said Clara's Boston money was no good anymore. "Ain't married, ain't working, ain't welcome," was all he said before tossing her suitcase into the street. That was 3 weeks ago. Since then, Clara had slept in barns, stolen bread, and traded the last of her jewelry for 2 wool blankets, one of which had lice. The only roof that didn't cost more than her pride was an abandoned mule shed behind a livery stable. The floor was cold mud, the roof missing half its shingles, but it kept off the worst of the snow. Her hands, once soft and jeweled, were blistered and red. Her fingers cracked so deeply they bled when she tried to light a fire. She stole newspaper from the train depot to keep her boots stuffed and dry. They still squelched with every step. Her Boston corset had long since been torn apart for tinder. The air sharpened as dusk bled into night. A blizzard came rolling in from the mountains, slow and monstrous, like a god rising in the dark. She'd shook. Clara huddled beneath her blanket, arms wrapped around her knees. Her breath curled in silver spirals into the gloom. Hunger gnawed. Loneliness gnawed harder. She tried to sleep but was too cold, too afraid, too angry. That night she heard the scratching of claws in the dark. A coyote. It padded closer, sniffing, its amber eyes glinting at the edge of the shed's light. Clara didn't move. She didn't scream. She reached instead for the iron fire poker she had stolen 2 nights earlier from behind the blacksmith's forge. When the animal came too close, she swung, hard. The poker caught the coyote in the ribs. It yelped, fled. She followed it to the door of the shed, just far enough to spit into the wind and snarl, "If I die, I'll haunt this land until the wind carves my name into the mountains." She meant it. The next morning was worse. Her firewood was wet, her fingers stiff with frostbite. She managed to boil snow into drinking water, but her stomach cramped from emptiness. She hadn't eaten in 2 days. That evening, as the storm softened and the moon rose pale and distant like a dying lantern, Clara noticed something strange. Near the edge of her makeshift fire pit, laid delicately on a flat stone, was a hunk of salted meat and a flint stone. Still warm to the touch, she jerked upright, eyes scanning the shadows. No one. Only the rustle of pine boughs and the groan of ice. But just beyond the circle of firelight, footprints, deep, boot-shaped prints leading into the trees, gone by. Morning. She didn't eat the meat right away. It could have been poisoned. But the next night another piece appeared, this time with sprigs of dried herbs wrapped in hide. She ate it, cautiously, gratefully. Someone was watching her. Someone knew she was alive. That thought was terrifying, and oddly comforting. 3 days later, she sat beside the fire, clutching a yellowed, water-damaged letter she kept folded in the pocket nearest her heart. Her sister's handwriting was fading, but Clara knew every word. I still remember the way we used to run through the cornfields with Mama's apron on our heads, pretending to be queens. I hope you found your throne out there, Clara. I hope you made it. Her sister had died from scarlet fever the previous winter. Clara hadn't. Made it back in time. She read the letter again, then pressed it to her lips, whispering, "I'm trying." The wind picked up, howled like it knew her pain. She screamed then. Not words, just rage, grief. A sound torn from the part of her soul that Boston had taught her to keep hidden. She screamed until her throat burned and her shoulders shook. She screamed until the coyotes fell silent and even the wind seemed to pause. Then she threw another branch on the fire, curled into her blankets, and didn't cry. Not anymore. In the gray bruises of dawn, she rose again. Not stronger. Not yet. But standing. And in the distance, deep beneath the hush of the snow-covered woods, something unseen watched, and didn't leave. The storm passed, but it left more than snow in its wake. It left Clara changed, half-starved, fingers raw, her eyes darker than before. She no longer trembled when the wind screamed. She no longer flinched at the crack of trees breaking under the weight of ice. Something in her had cracked too, but where it broke, something else began to grow. She left the shed, not because it was safe, but because staying still meant dying slow. She wandered into the trees, found a thicket near a frozen creek, and cleared it with bare hands. The ground was hard as iron, but she dug into it with a broken wagon axle she found by the railroad tracks. Her new shelter was little more than branches and tarp patched together with animal hide, but it stood through the wind. Her first snare failed, so did the second, and third. The fourth caught her own hand when it snapped too early. She screamed, into the forest, and the birds took off like she'd fired a gun. But she didn't give up. She studied the bones of rabbits left by foxes, studied where the deer walked when the snow fell deepest, learned the smell of bad meat and the signs of a good kill. She tried chopping wood once, missed the log, struck her foot, and limped for a week. She nearly froze again. Fever burned through her one night, twisting her vision with ghosts. Her lips blistered. Her skin turned the color of old parchment. When she woke, curled in a pile of snow, she saw it again. Meat and herbs wrapped in bark. The same flintstone. She boiled it. The bitter tea made her gag, but the next morning the fever was gone. She didn't say thank you aloud this time. She didn't need to. She knew someone was listening. Clara walked with her head low when she wandered to town, days later, hoping for salt or cloth scraps she might trade for. She didn't beg, just watched, waited, learned. That was when she met the trader, a tall man with cracked glasses and silver teeth. He claimed to be hauling goods between Laramie and Cheyenne, said he needed help, said he'd pay her in food and fire powder. Clara hesitated, but she hadn't eaten in 2 days. She followed him to the back of his wagon, where he promised supplies. Instead, he shoved her hard against the crates, tried to rip at her cloak. She screamed, kicked, but he was stronger. His breath reeked of whiskey and spoiled pork. She reached for her knife. It slipped from her grip. He laughed, but her hands found something else instead. The rusted horseshoe she'd kept for luck. She drove it into his cheek. He howled, reeled back. She grabbed the knife, slashed across his thigh. Blood sprayed across her dress. She didn't stop to watch him fall. She ran. Branches clawed at her as she dove into the forest. She ran until her lungs burned and the light vanished. She didn't stop until her knees gave out and she collapsed beneath a fallen pine. She lay in the dark, shaking. She stayed hidden for 3 days. When she finally stood again, She walked back to her camp and found her fire poker lying at the edge of the ring, where she'd left it months before. She picked it up, walked to a pine tree near her camp, and burned 3 letters into its bark. His initials: deep, angry, final. "I survived you," she whispered. Her voice was dry and hollow, but her grip didn't shake. The forest remained silent, until the night the wolves came. She heard them first, low snarls circling the camp, yellow eyes flickering beyond the tree line like cursed lanterns. She rose slowly, holding the poker in one hand, her knife in the other. The fire had gone out. One wolf stepped forward, then 2 more, snarling, hungry. Clara didn't back down, not this time. She raised the poker and screamed, but before the wolves lunged, a shot cracked through the night. One wolf fell dead in an instant. Another yelped as a second shot rang out. The pack scattered into the trees, howling. Clara spun toward the sound. There he was, the man, standing just beyond the smoke. Tall, fur-lined coat pulled tight, hair braided, eyes like riverstone. He held a long rifle in one hand and a bloodied tomahawk hung at his belt. He didn't move, didn't speak. He stepped forward and laid something at her feet. A knife, hand-carved, balanced, wrapped in bone. Then he turned and disappeared into the trees. She stared after him, breath catching. "Thank you," she whispered into the emptiness. She never heard a reply, but he came back. Not always, not regularly, but enough. Sometimes he left tracks she could follow, just far enough to find a rabbit warren or clean water. Sometimes he appeared beside her as if he'd grown from the trees, guiding her through deep snowdrifts or warning her with a silent gesture of danger ahead. He never touched her, never smiled, never told her his name. She called him Ghost. Once, when she gutted a hare too clumsily and lost half the meat, he crouched beside her without a word, took her hands, and showed her how to angle the blade. His hands were scarred, fingers thick and calloused. They smelled of smoke and cedar. She didn't flinch. The first time she carved her own spearhead, he took it in hand, examined the point, and handed it back with a single nod. That nod meant more than words ever could. She built stronger traps, cleaned her kills faster, reinforced her shelter, stitched torn cloth with bone needles. He taught by doing. She learned by surviving. Some nights they shared the fire in silence. She cooked. He chewed slowly, eyes on the woods. They didn't speak of pasts, didn't ask names. But in the stillness, trust grew. Not loud and sudden, but quiet as snow settling on branches. Clara began walking taller. She kept the knife he gave her at her hip, and the poker tucked beneath her cloak. One night she looked across the fire, at Ghost. He looked back, their eyes held. She didn't smile, she didn't need to. They understood each other now. 2 people carved by cold and betrayal, 2 survivors in a land that ate the weak. They didn't know it yet, but soon. The West would know their names. The wind shifted that spring, warmer, heavier. It carried the scent of wild grass and gunpowder, of something wicked riding across the land. Clara felt it before she saw it, in the uneasy silence of the woods, in the way the birds stopped singing. And even Ghost, Toma, though she still didn't know his name, tightened his jaw and scanned the horizon more often than he used to. They came just after the snowmelt, a band of 7, filthy and mean, flying no flag but death, ex-Confederates bitter and drunk on blood. They moved like wolves traveling by night, descending on lonely cabins and scattering the weak. They had no cause, just a hunger to burn. Clara saw the smoke before she reached the clearing, a black column rising against the bruised sky. She ran. Too late. The homestead had been friendly. A young couple and their little girl. Clara had traded salt for buttons there once. The child gave her a carved wooden doll, crooked and worn but smiling. Now the barn was cinders. The bodies of the parents lay near the well, twisted and wrong. The house had collapsed inward, half charred. Clara stepped over broken glass, boots, crunching through ash. Near the front steps she found the doll. Its head was cracked clean down the middle. She didn't cry. Didn't scream. She just picked it up and kept it. Vengeance doesn't rise all at once, it brews. It simmers in the dark and waits. She tracked them, watched from cliffsides and tree branches as they raided others, settlers too poor to defend themselves. One woman was dragged behind a horse for not opening her door fast enough. A young boy was left with a shattered leg after he threw a rock at one of them. Clara learned their names, their habits, their drinking holes. She watched as they set up, a makeshift camp near a canyon, laughing around their fire, dividing stolen furs and jewelry like kings. She started small. She crept in at night and slit the ties on their horses, released them into the wild. 2 days later, she cut through their food stores and pissed in their water barrels. Then, when she found a settler family bound and gagged in one of the tents, she crept in and sliced their ropes. The children cried, silently as she led them into the woods, guiding them by moonlight back to the path. The mother clutched Clara's hand for only a second before they vanished. It was working, until it wasn't. She returned for one final act, a quiet one, meant to steal their maps, disrupt their next raid, but the man on watch wasn't drunk that they caught her before she made it 5 feet past the tents. The leader, a bearded man with a crooked jaw and eyes like boiled eggs, laughed when he saw her. "A woman?" he barked, dragging her forward. "Hell, we got ourselves a little forest fox." They tied her to a pine, arms stretched tight, her face scraped with bark. The fire crackled 10 feet away. One of the men poured oil into a circle at her feet. Another sharpened a blade slowly, theatrically. "You light her up," the leader said, "and I swear the coyotes will smell her screaming for miles." They laughed. Clara didn't beg, not once. She watched the stars, counted them like prayers. Theo, match lit, and then thunder. No, not thunder, gunfire. The first shot took a man through the neck. He dropped like wet cloth. Then came the scream of steel. Toma burst from the dark, tomahawk in one hand, revolver in the other. He moved like wind, silent and brutal. The second raider barely lifted his gun before Toma's blade split his shoulder in two. The fire spilled sideways. One of them knocked over the oil. A third man lunged toward Clara with a torch. But Clara had already twisted her hands raw on the ropes. She broke free with a cry, grabbed the rifle the second raider had dropped, rolled to one knee, and fired. The recoil slammed her shoulder. The raider collapsed. The remaining two turned and ran. Toma didn't chase. Instead, he walked to Clara. She stood, shaking, blood on her face, holding the rifle like it had grown from her arm. They didn't speak. They just buried the bodies under pine and stone. The fire smoldered through the night. Clara sat by it, hands trembling but steadying with each breath. The broken doll rested near her feet. Toma knelt beside the flames, wrapping his tomahawk with fresh sinew. His knuckles were bruised, his coat singed. After a long time, he spoke. His voice was low, rough like uncut timber. "My name is Toma," he said. "Shoshone. I fought for the Union. Lost 2 brothers anyway." Clara didn't look up right away. "I figured you were no bandit," she said. "You don't kill for joy." He studied her for a moment, then nodded. "You fight like a woman who's already died once," he said. She met his eyes. "Maybe I did," Clara answered. "But I didn't. Stay dead." The land did not grow gentler. The snow still came early some years, and wolves still circled too close when the moon hung low. But Clara Merriweather no longer feared the dark. She and Toma worked side by side, cutting logs, raising beams, fitting stone and clay where wind once whistled through the bones of trees. Their hands were not soft, but they were sure. Together they built something. It wasn't much at first. A low building of pine logs and slate, perched near the creek where she'd once boiled bitter tea to survive a fever. But smoke now curled from its chimney in peaceful spirals, and the walls held firm against the storm. A trade post. That's what they called it. At first, the settlers came cautiously, one by one. Men with worn boots and rifle eyes. Women with children on their hips whispering about the ghost woman who had buried bandits in the hills. They came out of curiosity. And then, they stayed for respect. Clara traded fair, took pelts and potatoes as easily as coin. She refused. to sell ammunition to drunken men, and chased off more than one gambler with her fire poker still warm from the hearth. Toma did not smile often, but when he did, it came like sunlight breaking through storm clouds. He stood by the door, silent as always, a towering presence with a rifle that never missed. Word spread. They said the woman at the trading post had burned her past behind her, that she once faced down a dozen raiders with nothing but steel in her eyes and the ghost of a Shoshone warrior at her back. They said she had no fear of death, because death had already tried to take her once, and failed. They said her hands still smelled of smoke. By the time the railroad scouts arrived, the post had become something more than just shelter. It was a landmark, a symbol, a place where the hungry were fed and the crooked found justice. But justice has a price, and power does not like what it cannot control. The man's name was Charles Elston, a railroad boss with gold teeth and a mouth full of paper promises. He wore a frock coat too fine for the prairie and rode in with 5 men behind him, each armed, each paid to pull a trigger without blinking. He didn't knock when he arrived, just barged in, smiled at Clara with dead eyes, and set a folded map on her counter. "This land belongs to the Great Western Line now," he said, "and we're laying tracks straight through it." Clara didn't touch the map. She looked him dead in the eye. "This land was empty when we built here," she said. We asked no man's permission. We owe no man's tax." Elston chuckled. "I'm not here to argue with a woman who plays shopkeeper in the dirt. I'm here to give you a chance to walk away breathing." Toma stepped forward, rifle still, in hand, his silence louder than any threat. Elston paused, his smile faltered. "You think you can stop progress with a couple rifles?" he asked. Clara reached beneath the counter, pulled out the fire poker. It was blackened now, worn and familiar. "We stopped worse," she said. "You want this land, you bleed for it." The railroad men came back at dusk, 6 this time, maybe 7. They opened fire before they spoke. The first bullet shattered the window. Toma returned fire from the rooftop, his shots crisp and unforgiving. Clara ducked behind the counter, blood thudding in her ears. She counted to 3, popped, up and fired. One man dropped with a scream, but the second shot caught her just above the ribs. She stumbled backward, felt the heat of blood soaking her shirt. Toma yelled. She barely heard him. The next few minutes were chaos, gunfire, smoke, hooves fleeing, screams cut short, and then silence. When she opened her eyes again, the stars were overhead. Toma was carrying her into the cabin, cradling her gently. His breath sharp and furious, he laid her on the bed they'd built together. She winced. Grit her teeth, he stitched her in silence. The needle pulled, the thread burned, but she didn't cry out. When he finished, he sat beside her, still as stone. Her hand reached out, gripped his wrist. "If you leave now," she whispered, breath shallow, "I'll haunt you too." He didn't laugh. He didn't need to. He stayed. She smiled. Barely, but it reached her eyes. Time passed. The scar faded, but never vanished. So neither did she. Clara Merriweather lived, and not just in the flesh. Her name carved itself into the bones of that prairie. Years later, when travelers rode west and the wind rose hard from the canyon, they'd find a weathered wooden sign nailed to a pine. Merriweather's trading post, honesty before gold. And those who entered would hear her story. The woman thrown out with 17 cents in her purse and fire in her hands. The woman who haunted the winter until it feared her back. The woman who burned every lie, every chain, every injustice set upon her, and built something from the ash. Children would sit at their elders' feet and ask, was she real? And the answer was always the same. Real enough for the wind to remember. Real enough that if you stood quiet at dusk, you could hear her name carried across the plains. And if you listened real close, it sounded like fire. If Clara's fire lit a spark in you, share this story. Leave a comment about what you'd do if you had only 17 cents. And the courage to rise again. Don't forget to like and subscribe, because some stories, they deserve to be remembered.